What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today's video, we diving into some more budget decks that I kind of came up with. A little bit inspiration from some of what we're going to get with the new starter decks, but also kind of using that and kind of, shifting it a little bit here and there. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. It puts a +1/+1 counter on the channel. And with that being said, let's just dive in the video and let's just talk about it. Just wanted to give a special shout out to the channel members that you see your names here. These are the people who support the channel by either clicking the join button that's down below right next to the subscribe button if you want to get your name here on this list, or you can click the link in the description. I do appreciate it as it does help support the channel. Now on with your video. So the first deck up in the budget decks list that I kind of came up with is a Golgari Swarm style deck, utilizing some of the newer cards from Adventures of the Forgotten Realms, one of them being the Skeleton Swarming card. It is a rare in the deck. It is a 2 of in the deck, just because I want to keep the rares down lower in this deck. I only have the 2 of in the deck. You can add more copies if you do have more copies, but overall the idea here is we're utilizing this in the sense that it helps us give our skeleton creatures trample whenever and they attack each combat if able, and they get +X+0, or X is number of skeletons we control. And at the beginning of our end step, create a taps black skeleton creature token. If creature die this turn, create 2 of those creature tokens instead. So essentially, this is kind of like the bread and butter that kind of help us keep tempo, keep aggressive against our opponent. And the rest of the deck is kind of, hopefully holding them off or, putting pressure on them in the early game and whatnot. But that being said, the deck overall is a little bit of a mixture. It's not just skeletons. There's some zombies in here. There's also some vampires. We're also using the Death Priest of Miracle as another card in the deck that kind of helps boost our zombies, vampires, and skeletons, which is definitely beneficial to us. And we have the idea here, the secondary ability here, that at the beginning of our end step, if a creature we control, or if a creature died this turn, we may pay 1 if you do create a 1/1 black skeleton creature token. So those are the kind of the 2 cards we're really working on, and then we have a few other cards in the deck that kind of just help us get there. So the first card up is Dungeon Crawler. It's just a solid 2/1 for 1 mana, which is definitely very good. The one downfall, it does come into the battlefield tapped, and we're not really doing the dungeon thing, so we're not really going to be able to return it from our graveyard by completing a dungeon, but it's just a decent, 1-drop to have at an uncommon slot, which is definitely very good for this style of deck. Then we also have Shambling Ghast. It's another 1-drop in the deck. It's a 1/1 zombie. When it dies, we get to choose one. We either can give target creature -1/-1, or we can search the body and also create a treasure token. So depending on the situation, you can always make one or the other. The treasure token is actually pretty good in the deck because it can ramp you, so you can possibly play some of your cards a bit earlier. We also have Village Rites in the deck as a little bit of a draw mechanic. You can actually sacrifice your creatures if you have something like Skeletal Swarming out, or your our Lord out, and we can actually, draw 2 cards, get the skeleton back that we possibly sacrificed, or also possibly trigger an additional skeleton getting activated by the Swarming ability, which is definitely very good. And again, 2 cards out of it. Then we also have Deadly Dispute, which I actually think to be a very strong card. It's definitely a card I feel like most black decks should include, just because of how strong it is, because the additional cost is to sacrifice an artifact and or a creature. We create treasures in this deck, so we can sacrifice those, or we can sacrifice some of our tokens we are producing, but you get to draw 2 cards, and you also get to create a treasure token. So if you do sacrifice a treasure token, you do get 1 in return, which is definitely very good. Then you got Ghastly Gloom Hunter. It's a 2-mana 1/1 with that's a flying and a lifelink. That does have a kicker ability, and if it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. It's just a very decent kind of card to kind of keep us in the game, especially in the early game if our opponent is also being pretty aggressive as well. The lifelink is pretty nice, and also having something in the air is pretty good. And in the late game, we can kind of draw it and actually make it a 3/3 flyer, which is also very good. And it does benefit us from our our Lord that helps pump our zombies as well. Then we have the Malakir Coldblade. It's a special card that's only exclusive to the starter decks, but you can play it in other decks, but you can only play it in best of 1 format. So this is something you can't play in a best of 3 format, but it's a pretty decent card that whenever a creature an opponent controlled dies, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Malakir Coldblade. Yet again, it's just a very synergistic card. It's definitely pretty decent 2-drop, card in our deck because, with the little bit of removal we do have and possibly making our opponent have to chump block some of our creatures, this is something that can definitely grow pretty big, and if our opponent doesn't deal with it, it can actually overrun them in that sense as well. Then we have Power Word Kill. It's a 2-mana removal spell. It's just a pretty solid 2-mana removal spell. I know it's very limited because there are a little bit more of the angels, the demons, the devils, and the dragons in the format at the moment. But, it's one of those things, 2 mana, it's not too bad. It's one of those things you could probably toss it up to maybe even poison the cup or something like that. Play what you want based on what you feel like and what you like. I'm just playing Power Word Kill because to me it felt the best out of everything. But if you feel like you're getting paired up against, like Prismari dragons or, Orzhov Angels or something like that, you can always swap it out and maybe switch it up if that's maybe what you want to do. But this is what I'm kind of going with, and I think removal is kind of it's a personal opinion when it comes to this, just because none of the removals like that great I think currently in the 2-drop slot, but there is some decent stuff in there. I think Moss-Pit Skeleton, it's an interesting Golgari kind of skeleton creature that I feel like never really saw play when it first came out in Zendikar, but it's an interesting card here. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with kicker of 3. If it was kicked, and just battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and then whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put onto a creature you control, if Moss-Pit Skeleton is in our graveyard, you may have it come onto the top of our library. So it has kind of like a regenerate ability, and it gets put on top of your library. So in the later games, maybe if you play like one that's kicked and there's one already in your graveyard, you can get the one back on top of your library and kind of have another skeleton that you can play the following turn kicked, which is definitely very good. Or if you have Village Rites or Deadly Dispute, you can always draw it that way. So overall, a pretty interesting card that has kind of this recurring effect, which is definitely pretty cool. Not the greatest because it goes on top of your library, but it's still okay. And like I said, we have Death Priest of the Malakruel. It's a 4-mana 2/2. It gives all our creatures +1/+1, and it has the ability of us paying 1 mana if a creature has died at the end of our turn to create a 1/1 black skeleton creature that actually comes out into the battlefield as a 2/2, which is definitely very good as we're just continually putting pressure on our opponent by creating skeletons against them, which is definitely awesome. Even if our creatures do die in the process, we do have a way to kind of reoccur some skeletons without actually having to pay a ton of mana. And it just giving all our other creatures +1/+1 is also very good. Then you got Bind of the Old Gods. It's a 4-mana removal spell. Destroy target non-land permanent opponent controls, which is definitely very good. It doesn't target just creatures. It can target, enchantments, artifacts, planeswalkers, which is definitely very beneficial. It helps us ramp a little bit on the 2nd chapter. And on the 3rd chapter, it gives all our creatures Death Touch, which we can attack in them more aggressively and, make our opponent make some chumps. And the Death Touch will allow us to possibly kill the creatures that have the chump block in front of some of our creatures. Then in the 5-drop slot, this is where it kind of gets a little bit interesting. We have Tenure Incaster. It's an interesting card. It's one of those things I'm not too fond of in the deck, but I do think it's an okay card. It synergizes pretty decent with Moss-Pit Skeleton because it does put a +1/+1 counter onto a target creature we control. And then whenever a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. So there's a little bit of life drain on it, which is also pretty good. Other than that, it's just a pretty generic card. It costs a little bit expensive just for that ability, but it's just something decent to have in the top end just because we are not playing 4 copies of Skeleton Swarming. I do think this is definitely something you probably remove and just add more Skeleton Swarmings if that's what you want to do. But it's just something I decided to put here just as a decent 5-drop. Then you get Skeleton Swarming. Like I said, it's a very good card. It's one of those things that allows us to reoccur skeletons at the end of our turn, regardless of what happens. We're at least getting 1. The more skeletons we have on the battlefield, the bigger the skeletons get. This also includes the other skeletons we have out on the battlefield. The one downfall is it does force all our skeletons to have to attack each combat step, so it does also force our other skeletons that aren't, part of this to be attack every turn if able, but it does give them trample and does give them additional +X+0, where X is the amount of skeletons, so that's very beneficial. And we do start producing 2 if we are able to remove a creature at least every single turn that at the end of our turn, which is also pretty good. So we definitely can swarm our opponent with a ton of skeletons very, very quickly. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 13 of the swamps, 7 of the forests, and 4 of the woodland chasms. It's just a very solid, pretty decent. We're mostly black with a splash of green, so that's kind of why we're playing mostly black with a splash of green essentially. But other than that, the deck does play pretty well. There's some consistency issues that I do think that happens when you do only play 2 ofs, like especially the Skeleton Swarming. You don't draw it every game, but when you do draw it, it does feel pretty impactful, which is definitely very good. Other than that, I think the deck plays very, very well. You can overwhelm your opponent with just a bunch of little small drops that just get bigger and bigger as the game goes on, especially when you get your Death Priest, the Malakruel, out on the battlefield, which is definitely beneficial to the overall style of the deck. With that being said, let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. So this next deck up on the list is a Rakdos Treasure list that I kind of came up with. I feel like this is kind of something that everyone's kind of experimented with, in some form or manner. This one is a little bit more on the expensive side, as it does have 4 rares in it compared to the previous deck, which only had 2. But I felt like there was a couple cards in there that I wanted to include that were part of the new Adventures of the Forgotten Realms that kind of synergize pretty well with the treasure mechanic overall as a whole. But with that being said, the overall idea of the deck is to produce a lot of treasures, combine that with something like Callian Reclusive Painter, which if we pay treasure to cast certain creatures, they enter the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counter on them for each treasure mana that was spent to cast on them. The one downfall is we aren't playing, Goldspan Dragon. I just figured, for rares is probably more than enough, and Goldspan Dragon's actually a mythic, but it's definitely a card you could add into the deck if that's something you're looking for, because it does make all our treasures produce 2 mana instead of the 1 mana, which is definitely very beneficial. But other than that, the deck is pretty straightforward with what it's trying to do. As you can kind of see, there's some cards that look familiar from the previous deck we did that have black in it. I just feel like these are some new mono black staples. That black is just you're going to see in a lot of black decks regardless of if they're playing treasures or not, just because the cards overall are very good. But the first card up is Shambling Gas. It's a very solid card. Like I said in the prior deck, gives target creature -1/-1 when it dies, or we can actually search the body and create a treasure token, which for the treasure deck is what we're trying to do. So that most of the time we are going to create a treasure token to help ramp up. Then we also have Frostbite in here just because we are playing Snowlands. I do think Frostbite is definitely a very good spot removal for 1 mana, which is pretty awesome. First 2 damage, and then later if we have 3 or more snow permanents, it does 3 damage instead at instant speed. So definitely very good spot removal. Then we go back to Deadly Dispute. Yet again, another very solid 2 mana. Draw 2. Create a treasure token, and we can sacrifice a creature and or a treasure token, which we can sacrifice something like a Shambling Ghast. Create a treasure token, create another treasure token, and also draw 2 cards out of it, and then all of a sudden have 4 mana out on the battlefield. Then we got Flunk in here. This is kind of one of those things, depending on how, you feel. You can also play Flunk, which is a pretty decent removal spell. It does give target creature -X/-X, which does get around indestructible. But the one downfall is if your opponent has a lot of cards in hand, it doesn't do a whole bunch because it gives target creature -X, where X is 7, X -7. The number is 7 minus the number of cards in that hand. It just sounds really weird when trying to word it. So essentially, you do 7 -5, and that gives target creature -2/-2. So the idea here is you want to play against an opponent who's, it's very good against very aggressive decks that are really emptying their hands, so it can really target a lot of things. But against a more like in control deck or a deck that draws a lot, it's definitely not as good of a removal spell, but it is still 2 mana and is instant speed, so definitely very good nonetheless. Then we have Horde Robber as another interesting 2-drop here in the deck. Because we are playing a little bit on the budget, we are playing something that would probably be more so see play in limited, but we're putting it in here just as a decent blocker as well as a decent attacker. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we create a treasure token, which is what we're trying to do here, just trying to ramp up with our treasures, utilizing them to play other things, or sacrifice them to then eventually draw cards with another card in the deck. Then we have Callian, Reclusive Painter. Like I said, it benefits us, casting creatures with our treasure mana that we're producing, as well as whenever it enters the battlefield, we actually create a treasure token. So the idea of giving something additional +1/+1 for each treasure mana spent on them is definitely very good, and also getting a treasure token when we cast it is also good as well. The Skullport Merchant, which is I think a very solid card for what it is. It's a 3 mana 1/4 that when it enters the battlefield, we create a treasure token. For 2 mana, 1 colorless and a black, we can sacrifice another creature or a treasure, and we get to draw a card. So if we're producing a bunch of treasures, we can sacrifice those rather than our creatures. We do have ways to produce additional treasures when things happen, so that is definitely pretty cool. And for 2 mana to just draw a card is pretty awesome, with just the idea of sacrificing mana or sacrificing a treasure to do so is definitely very good. Or worst case scenario, you can always sacrifice a creature that may be getting targeted by a removal spell other than itself. So that's also pretty awesome as well. Then we got Zorn. It's a 3 mana 3/2. This is kind of like the card that helps us, boost our treasure collection as a whole. If we create 1 or more treasure tokens, instead create those tokens plus an additional treasure token. So essentially, all the things that produce 1 token now produce 2 tokens. So allowing us to ramp up even faster, allowing us to have more things to sacrifice to the merchant. Just an overall pretty solid card to kind of include in the deck. And I do think this is kind of one of those things that in other treasure decks that are more full-fledged out, I do think this is definitely very good, especially with the Goldspan Dragon. Whenever a Goldspan Dragon attacks, it then essentially would create 2 treasures that produce 4 mana instead of 1 treasure that produces 2. So you can kind of see the synergies with anything that really produces additional treasure mana. Then we have Stormkin Artist, which is kind of like our card that I'm kind of having here in the deck that kind of replaces the Goldspan Dragon that we don't have. It's an interesting card in the sense that it gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control, which synergizes very well for treasure. And the other benefit too is whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we get to create a treasure token. So we do have some creature spells that we have in the deck, so we can actually produce a pretty decent amount of treasure tokens combined with Zorn. So we can definitely ramp him up. The one downfall is it increases his power and not his toughness, so it is kind of like a glass cannon kind of card. But it's one of those things that can get in for some big damage if your opponent decides not to block it, or you catch him off guard. Combine Frostbite after Zorn's out plus this, all of a sudden you have 2 treasures. It's now 4/2. Your opponent now has to deal with it. The other thing too is we can actually pay for it in treasure mana, so it comes down the battlefield even stronger. The one downfall is it won't be as strong power wise because we would have to sacrifice treasure tokens in order to get it out in the battlefield. But other than that, you know, it's one of those things that it's kind of like it helps and doesn't help that we are using our treasure mana to then cast it, but at the same time too, it comes in bigger, but the treasure mana makes it stronger. So it's one of those things, depending on the situation, you can kind of play it out and figure out what works best. The unexpected windfall. It's a 4 mana draw spell. As additional cost to cast a spell, discard a card. You know, sometimes in these decks you kind of draw cards that are kind of useless. If your opponent's, you know, maybe you're drawing too many lands, you can discard a land. If you're drawing too many removal spells, but your opponent's not doing too much in the way of creatures to remove, you can always, you know, discard one of those. But essentially, you get to discard a card, draw 2 cards, and create 2 treasure tokens. So yet again, just creating all the treasure mana as possible, which helps us ramp up, helps us, you know, sacrifice, yada yada yada. The whole use the treasure mana for whatever we need to kind of depend on the situation. You have Orcus, Prince of the Undeath. It's a very interesting card if you haven't seen him already. It's an X 4 mana card. It's a 5/3 fly and trample. When it enters the battlefield, choose one. Either each creature gets -X/-X on a turn, where you lose X life. So it's kind of like a, you know, massive board wipe, kind of like a Crippling Fear. You get a creature out of it, and it gives all other creatures -X/-X. So it's definitely very good if your opponent's being more aggressive. The board's much wider, giving everything -3/-3 across the board by paying, you know, 7 mana, which this deck can produce pretty early to kind of combat, you know, something like a mono white is definitely very good. And the other idea here is you can return up to X target creatures with total mana cost value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and they gain haste. So you can get things back that may have been wiped out by a board wipe or something, or you maybe had to chump block the turn prior, play this, get them back, and then all of a sudden you can attack back in as a swing back, which could also possibly end the game right then and there. But other than that, it's a very solid card. It is definitely a card that I would suggest to have more copies of in the deck, just because it is very good, and it definitely fits well with this whole, you know, spend treasure mana, because you can spend the treasure mana for the X cost and have it come into the battlefield as like a 7/5 or something like that, you know, depending on how much treasure mana you do have. Then for the mana base, it's yet again pretty straightforward, because we are playing a little bit more on the black side than the red side. We do have 11 swamps, we do have 9 mountains, and we do have 4 of the sulphurous mire, and we are playing snow mana because we are playing frostbite. Other than that, you know, it's pretty standard Rakdos Treasure style deck that you may have already seen, but we, you know, I put my budget spin on it to make it a little bit cheaper, to, you know, kind of see if this is something you want to play. Maybe you do have some of the cards already, and you wanted to test it out before you really commit in making the full, you know, expensive version that has mythics, rares, and all that stuff. Let's move on to the next deck and let's talk about it. So this next deck up is kind of, I feel like, a deck that I always kind of suggest whenever there's a new set that comes out. I think at least since Kaldheim essentially came out, and this is Boros Equipments. You know, I think prior it's been more dwarf related, and I think now that we have some other cards that got introduced with Adventure of the Forgotten Realms, we've gotten more equipment base and more on the warrior side than just strictly doors. But essentially what we're trying to do here is we're trying to play a bunch of equipments. We are just trying to overwhelm opponent by just making, like, you know, one big creature or something like that, with essentially, you know, just pumping them up with a bunch of equipment and then swinging in for a bunch of damage. So what we're doing in the deck is pretty straightforward. We are playing the Brunor Battle Hammer. It's a 4 mana 5/3. Each creature you control gets +2/+0 for each equipment attached to it, and then you may pay 0 rather than pay the equip cost of the first equip ability you activate each turn. So essentially, it turns any of our equipment's equip costs from, you know, this one being 2 down to 0 if it's the first one we're going to equip on our turn. After that, all the other equips cost their normal equip cost, which is definitely very good. The deck does have only 2 rares in it, being the fighter class as being a card that helps us find, you know, more equipments into our hand, as well as makes our equipments cheaper to activate in the later game, and even on turn 5 we can, you know, make it to get to level 3, and whenever a creature you control attacks, up to 1 target creature blocks this combat if able. So essentially you can force a block even if your opponent doesn't want to block that creature or block with that creature. But other than that, the deck is pretty straightforward on what we're trying to do. We have Resolute Strike, which allows us to kind of equip any equipment to any creature, as long as it's a warrior, which is definitely very good, and also gives a +2/+2 for 1 mana, which is definitely awesome. We also have Duel and Rapier in the deck. It's a 1 mana flash equipment that when it enters the battlefield, attach to target creature you control. Equip creature gets +2/+0. It does equip for 4, but, you know, we do have ways to make it equip for cheaper. Then we have Fireblade Charger, 1 mana 1/1. As long as the Fireblade Charger is equipped, it has haste. Whenever it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So we can hit it to a face, hit it to a creature. And plus, we're playing equipments, it can get very big, and we can throw much bigger damage to, you know, either opponent's face and or their creatures. Then we also have the Great Axe. It's a 1 mana equipment that has an equipment cost of 5 to actually equip it to a creature. A creature gets +4/+0. But like I said, we do have ways to make it cheaper, so we don't actually have to pay the 5. Like we do have our Dwarf Warrior here, or we do have a Resolute Strike, which is definitely pretty awesome. Then we have Ingenious Smith. It's a 2 mana 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, with to look at top 4 cards of our library, we can reveal an artifact card among them and put it into our hand, put the rest on the bottom of our library in any random order. And then whenever one or more artifacts enter the battlefield under control, it gets +1/+1. And this ability triggers only once each turn, so you can't just throw a bunch of equipments on the battlefield, but it's definitely a good thing for a card to get much bigger and bigger every time we play an equipment, which definitely synergizes very well with what we're trying to do with the deck. Then, of course, because we are playing equipments, we are going to play Core Blade Master. It's a 2 mana 1/1 with double strike. Warriors you control have double strike, so any warrior that we have on the battlefield, which is, I think, all of them, I think except for the Smith, will all have double strike, so it makes them that much stronger. And himself or herself also has double strike, so that's also very good without even having equipment on it. Then we get the Paladin Shield. This is the kind of surprise thing. You can kind of, play it at flash speed. It enters the battlefield, we get to attach to target creature control, which allows us to maybe chump block something to catch an opponent off guard. Or we can equip it for 3 if our creature does die in the process. But it's definitely very cool to kind of have a flash, speed equipment that we can just, throw on the battlefield maybe at the end of turn and put it on a creature without actually having to pay any mana. Then we have the Rune of Sustenance, which is another interesting card for the deck. It's a 2 mana aura rune, enchants a permanent, not just a creature. When it enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card, which is definitely very good. Card draw is very key for this deck because we want to draw into our equipments or more creatures. And as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it has lifelink, and as long as enchanted permanent is an equipment, it also gives lifelink. So the one thing is we kind of want to put it on our equipments, even just because, if our creature does die, we can still have this rune out on the battlefield, which definitely will help us. Given anything lifelink is pretty awesome when we move the equipments around, which definitely will help as well. Then we also have the Rune of Speed, just a 1 copy of when it enters battlefield, we get to draw a card, and then whenever enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+0 in haste. And as long as enchanted permanent is an equipment, equipped creature gets +1/+0 in haste. So yet again, kind of the same effect here on either creature or permanent or equipment, giving them +0 haste, which is definitely pretty awesome. And also the draw card effect is definitely awesome as well. We already kind of went over the fighter classes. 2 mana enchantment class that we can level up 2 other times. When it enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for equipment card, reveal it, put it into our hand, and then shuffle. And then for 3 mana, equip abilities you activate cost 2 less to cast, so just making our equip abilities across the field that much cheaper to cast. And then for 5 mana, we have the ability that whenever a creature we control attacks, up to 1 target creature blocks this combat if able, which is definitely awesome as well. Just force some blocks just because our opponent may not want to chump block with something, but having it there is definitely pretty cool. Then we have the Relic Axe, which I do think is a very strong equipment for only being 2 mana. It's when it enters the battlefield, target creature control, you get to equip it to target creature control. A creature has +1/+1. If it's a warrior, it's +2/+1, which synergizes very well with our deck because I believe all our creatures except for the Artificer is a warrior. So it's definitely a card that will get put onto something and get much bigger pretty quickly. And on turn 2, you put this on a charger. Now your charger is a 3/1 or 3/2. It makes it kind of interesting that they're either going to take 3 damage or they can block, and then the creature that they're probably blocking with will probably die in the process, and then you're throwing 3 damage at their face, which just synergizes very, very well. The next card up is Plate Armor. This is a new card from Adventures of the Forgotten Realms, 3 mana equipment. Equipped creature gets +3/+3 and has Ward 1, equipped for 3, and this ability costs 1 less to activate for each other equipment you control. So it's definitely something that stacks with the more equipments you have, the cheaper this does get. So eventually it can cost 0 to equip, so you can just move around freely at the end of your turn. And I like the idea of giving something Ward for the 1, so it makes it that your opponent has to pay an additional 1 mana to target that creature, or that spell gets countered or ability gets countered, which is definitely awesome. And it's just cool that it gets cheaper as well, so even if your creatures do die but your equipment stay out, these it will still cost less mana to equip eventually. Then we get the Bearded Axe. It's kind of like the big finisher for the deck as a whole. It's a 3 mana equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each dwarf equipment and or vehicle control. We have a lot of equipments in the deck, so our creatures will get bigger and bigger for each other equipment we have on the battlefield. And we do have 1 dwarf being the Brunor, the Battle Hammer, so it can get bigger that way as well. And for 2 mana, you can equip it to target creature control, or if Brunor is out, it can cost 0. So it's definitely a very big finisher to the deck. The one downfall is, unfortunately, because we're not playing any sort of way to give anything trample as the one downfall to the deck as a whole. We can make creatures as big as possible, but if they our opponent just chumps blocks all day, it's the one downfall to the deck. Then, like I said, we got Brunor Battlehammer, 4 mana, 5/3. Each equipped creature you control gets +2/+0 for each equipment you have attached to it, and then he makes, you know, the first equipment each turn cost 0 to pay, other than its normal cost, which is definitely very good, and you can activate it once each turn. So definitely a very interesting style deck, very all in on the equipments. Definitely, you know, plays, you know, very aggressively. You're just trying to, you know, essentially. In terms of Magic, people kind of consider decks like this kind of like a Tron style deck, where you kind of put all in on one creature, and hopefully that creature swings in very aggressively, and your opponent just has to deal with it in some sort of way, or if they don't, they're probably dead. But other than that, it's a cool deck to play. It's definitely, you know, if you're looking for something that plays a lot of equipments, plays a lot of other cards to help, you know, bolster their equipments or make them stronger, it's definitely awesome in that sense. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. We have 10 plains, 9 of the mountains, 1 Axguard Armory. I only put 1 in here just because it comes in the battlefield tapped, and its ability to sacrifice it and search your library for an aura card or an equipment card is kind of expensive. But it's definitely a good plus to have in the deck if you're really looking for that one equipment or aura to finish off the game. And then we have 4 copies of Lorehold Campus. We're not playing snow mana here, but having the idea to possibly scry is definitely something you can think about instead of playing the snow mana that has just its snow mana and it taps for these 2 colors. It's definitely something as a possibility, just because the scry ability can be kind of strong when you're really looking for that answer. And the last deck up on the list is a green-white Lifegain deck. I do think this is definitely a very strong deck, and with it being a deck that's not super expensive to craft, and you can utilize a lot of cards from the mono white starter deck to kind of get you started. This deck does include 2 rares, and I do think the synergy of the ways you can kind of get Lifegain is pretty awesome with what cards you do have available. And we are doing the green-white thing because we are utilizing the Trelasara Moondancer, which is a very strong 2-drop. At being a 2-drop, that's a 2/2, and whenever we gain life, we get to put +1/+1 counter on it, and also get to scry. And our deck has many ways of actually gaining life. I kind of went with the build that's actually one of those things that we have a lot of ways to actually gain additional life to kind of get to those certain things in our deck that trigger other abilities of certain things. So like if you look at here, like Honor Troll, it's another card that's actually pretty decent. I do think it's a little bit on the expensive side if you don't have 25 or more life, but if you do get to 25 or more life, it gets +2/+1, so it becomes a 4, which is definitely very good with Vigilance. And the other idea is it does give us that additional +1 life to all our life gain, which makes, you know, us gain a lot more life a lot quicker. Also, we do have the 2 copies of Righteous Valkyrie as being that other card that is very beneficial to us in the deck. The idea here is, even though we don't play a lot of clerics in the deck, I do like the idea here that if we have 7 more life than our starting life total, which if we're playing a normal best of 1 game, we have to get to 27, and it gives all our creatures +2/+2 until pretty much unless we go below that number, which is pretty awesome, and just makes everything we control that much stronger. Our opponent really has to deal with this card in order to kind of, you know, combat us. And other than that, the deck is pretty straightforward on what we're trying to do. It does have a couple cards, like I said, from the mono white starter deck, so this deck is only legal in best of 1. You can't carry it over to best of 3, with it being the first 2 cards here in the 2-drop slot. But other than that, the deck is playable in, you know, standard best of 1, which is definitely pretty awesome. And if you're looking for a way to improve that mono white deck, this is definitely probably the way you want to go. But to start off, we got the Cleric class at 1 mana. If we gain that much life, we gain that much life +1, which is definitely very good. Just gain additional life is always pretty awesome. You know, whatever we gain, we just gain that additional 1. For 4 mana, we can level up to level 2. Whenever we gain life, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control. So essentially, this Cleric class now gives the ability of some of our creatures that grow when we gain life to any creature that we want to. And then for 5 mana, we get to level 3. We get to return target creature card we control from our graveyard to the battlefield, and we gain life equal to its toughness. So it kind of has the ability that Righteous Valkyrie has, which is awesome. And then while it's out, we technically gain the life equal to its toughness +1. So we do get that additional 1 extra life that is actually kind of interesting. It doesn't actually include that, but other than that, it's a pretty awesome card. Very versatile. Being uncommon is also pretty awesome. Then Hallowed Priest, like this is one of the cards from the mono white starter deck. Whenever we gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on Hallowed Priest. So it's one of those cards that can get very big very quickly if you play a lot of creatures to make you gain life, or have a lot of creatures that gain life whenever things enter the battlefield. We have Impassioned Orator. It's a 2 mana 2/2. Whenever another creature you control enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. Like I said, you know, things that synergize with life gain, which is pretty awesome. We have Revitalize. It's a 2 mana. You gain 3 life. You get to draw a card. So a little bit of card draw in the deck, just because sometimes, you know, you're looking for an answer, and also just giving yourself a way to instantly gain some life is pretty awesome as well. You have Prosperous Innkeeper to 2 mana 1/1 when enters the battlefield. Create a treasure token, which is pretty awesome for that little bit of ramp. And then whenever another creature enters the battlefield under our control, we gain 1 life. Yet again, another creature that synergizes with us playing creatures. We have Trelasa Moondancer, 2 mana 2/2. Whenever you gain a life, put a +1/+1 counter on it. We don't get an additional +1/+1 counter if we gain that 1 additional life. Every time we have a life gain trigger, whenever we gain any life, that initial time, that's when we gain it, no matter how much life we do gain. But if we do gain, 1 life here, 1 life here, we'll get a trigger each time that happens. So that's actually pretty awesome. Then we have Angel of Vitality. It's a 3 mana 2/2. This is, I think, another card that's not standard legal, but is in the mono white starter deck, so it is legal in best of 1. But it's a flyer that's 3 mana. If we gain that much life, we gain that much life +1. So another card just gives that additional 1 life. And then if we are over 25 or more life, it gets +2/+2. So it's pretty awesome as well. It gets bigger, the more life we do have. Then we have Core Celebrant. It's a 3 mana 1/4. Whenever Core Celebrant or another creature enters the battlefield under our control, we gain 1 life. So another creature that just triggers life gain triggers when things enter the battlefield, which is awesome. Then we have Righteous Valkyrie, like I said, another creature that, allows clerics that whenever they enter the battlefield under control, we gain life equal to that creature's toughness. So we do have a few clerics. There's one cleric here, there's another cleric here, there's a cleric here, there's a cleric here. So we do have ways to gain some small points of life, but, it's not a ton of life, but it's definitely life that does matter, especially when we start having things that give that much life +1, which is definitely pretty awesome as well. They have Honor Troll. Like I said, it's just kind of a pretty solid, 3-drop. That's a 2/3 with Vigilance. If we gain that much life, we gain that much life +1. And it has +2/+1 as long as we have 25 or more life. Kind of like Angel of Vitality. This has Flying, this has Vigilance. That's really the only big difference between the two. This one does become a little bit bigger as this, well, I guess they equal the same at the end of the day. But, it depends on what you like. But I just figured just kind of have a little balance of both. And then for the mana base, it's pretty straightforward. 11 plains, 9 of the forest, and 4 of the Arctic tree line. You could also, I don't think there's a Strixhaven for green-white land. I don't remember there being green-white. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just thinking off the top of my head. I don't think that was one of the classes or one of the schools in Strixhaven. But it's a possibility. But we are playing this tap lane as just having some way to either have a dual land of some sort for this particular color. But other than that, it's just a pretty solid, straightforward deck. If you're just looking for something to play life gain at a budget, this is definitely a good deck to start out with. And it's definitely a good deck that you can upgrade and actually add in more things that will help with that whole life gain kind of style and strategy. So with that being said, those are some pretty interesting budget style decks. If that's something you're really looking forward to play, if you're someone who's a little bit on a budget, these are some more decks that you can definitely check out if you've already seen my previous deck. There'll probably be a card for the other budget deck video that I did when the set first dropped. You can definitely check out as well. I'll probably put a card somewhere right here at the end of the video. But if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. It puts a +1/+1 counter on the channel. Until next time, I'll see you later.